Today we're beginning a series of videos to explore plant-insect interactions. These interactions highlight some of the most dynamic and complex relationships in nature. Plants and insects have coexisted for over 400 million years, evolving together in ways that have profoundly shaped both their biology and the ecosystems around them. In this video, we'll introduce some of the foundational concepts and patterns that define these interactions. Plants, as stationary organisms, face a unique challenge in their survival. They can't simply flee from herbivores to move to more favorable conditions. Instead, they rely on adaptations that help them withstand the pressures and attacks from insects. Over millions of years, plants have developed a range of defenses in order to deter and limit damage from these herbivores. Now, these defenses aren't just physical barriers, like thorns and tough leaves. They also include chemical compounds that are toxic or distasteful to insects. And insects have often found a way to deal with them. For example, the wild tobacco plant produces nicotine, which is a potent alkaloid, which is toxic to most insects. But if an insect were to, for some reason, evolve a way to deal with this toxic alkaloid, it would have access to a food resource that most other herbivores couldn't eat. Enter the tobacco hornworm. This crazy caterpillar has evolved specialized enzymes that break down the nicotine before it can affect the caterpillar's nervous system. Additionally, the hornworm's midgut lining has evolved to be less permeable to nicotine, reducing the likelihood that any of the residual toxin would enter its bloodstream. This example of the wild tobacco plant evolving a defense and then the tobacco hornworm evolving a countermeasure typifies the interactions that occur between plants and insect herbivores that have driven morphological changes to both plants and insects for millions of years. Herbivorous insects make up about a third of the biodiversity on planet Earth. The success of these insects often relies on specialized adaptations that allow them to bypass or tolerate both mechanical and chemical defenses. This back and forth, where plants evolve defenses and insects evolve counter-adaptations, is called coevolution. In this process, plants and insects exert reciprocal selective pressures on each other. As plants develop new defenses, herbivores evolve mechanisms to overcome them, and the plants ultimately evolve new defenses, and so on. The ecological roles that plants and insects play in ecosystems are foundational. Plants form the base of nearly every terrestrial food chain by converting sunlight into energy through the process of photosynthesis. As primary producers, they provide food and shelter for a multitude of other organisms, including insects. Herbivorous insects are primary consumers, feeding on the plants, and then they serve as prey for secondary consumers, like birds and other animals. This interaction forms an essential link in the transfer of energy and nutrients through ecosystems. The ways in which plants and insects interact impact not only the individual species in the interaction, but entire ecosystems. Let me give you a specific example. The willow tree, Salix alba, is frequently targeted by the willow sawfly, Nematis salicis. In order to deter this, willow trees have evolved to produce a range of defensive chemical compounds like phenolic glycosides that make the leaves bitter and, in some cases, toxic to the larva. Willows also have evolved tannins which interfere with the larva's digestion, reducing their growth and making the sawfly larva more susceptible to predators. These defensive adaptations in willows impact not only the sawflies, but also the broader community. How? Well, the resources that willows invest in chemical defenses can come at the expense of willow growth and reproduction, potentially making them less competitive. This can cause a shift in plant community composition, reducing both the occurrence and the size of willow trees. But of course, there are also birds in the community that depend on willows for nesting sites, and they really benefit from the sawfly larva as a food source. A reduction in willow size and occurrence could impact the availability of nesting sites, and if willow defenses are too effective, they could reduce the sawfly population to the extent where it would impact the insectivorous bird populations, who may then face a population reduction or turn to other organisms for food in the community. In this way, the evolution and expression of willow defenses can have a ripple effect across the entire ecological community. There are different types of plant-insect interactions, each with their unique characteristics and consequences. Some are antagonistic. Herbivory is generally antagonistic. Herbivory can take lots of different forms. You've got leaf chewing, where insects like caterpillars or beetles consume large portions of leaves, often leaving visible holes and skeletonized remains. You have sap sucking, where insects like aphids and leafhoppers pierce plant tissue to feed on the sap, which can weaken the plant and spread disease. You have gall inducement, where insects like gall wasps and some other flies can induce abnormal growths, called galls, on plants that allow the larva to develop and feed on the nutrient-rich gall tissue. You have leaf mining, where insects like leaf miner larvae can burrow between the upper and lower surfaces of the leaves, creating winding and blotchy patterns as they consume the internal leaf tissue. You have root feeding, where certain beetle larvae and nematodes feed on the roots of plants, which obviously can affect water and nutrient uptake. There's seed predation, where insects like weevils feed on seeds, which has a direct impact on the plant's reproductive success. You have stem and wood boring from things like bark beetles and wood boring larvae, where they tunnel into stems and trunks, disrupting the plant's vascular system and weakening its structure. And you have flower feeding, where insects consume flowers or flower parts, which can interfere with pollination and reduce seed production. Each of these forms of herbivory has unique impacts on plant growth, survival, and reproductive success. And they all have impacts on the broader community dynamics. Not all plant-insect interactions are antagonistic, though. Some are mutualistic, where both organisms benefit. Perhaps the most well-known example of this is pollination. Many plants rely on insects like bees, beetles, butterflies, and moths to transfer pollen from one flower to another, facilitating reproduction. In exchange for this service, plants offer nectar, a high-energy food source for the pollinators. This mutualistic relationship is so integral that without pollinators, many plant species and the animals that depend on them would face serious challenges to their survival, and perhaps even extinction. This continuous coevolutionary relationship between plants and insects has contributed to the evolutionary diversification of both groups. Let me give you a couple more examples. The mustard family, Brassicaceae, it produces glucosinolate compounds that deter generalist herbivores. However, an ancestor of the cabbage white butterfly of the genus Pieris evolved an enzyme to break down these compounds, allowing them to feed on mustard plants. This adaptation gave Pieris exclusive access to a reliable food source, and as a result, Pieris populations grew and expanded geographically, introducing them to new habitats and new environments with new selective pressures. These selective pressures in novel environments played a big part in the diversification of the Pieris genus, which now has more than 30 species. Or we could look at the case of the acacia trees. Acacia trees have robust defenses through large thorns and chemical compounds like tannins, which make the leaves tough and unpalatable, which deters a lot of herbivores. Additionally, some acacia species have developed a mutualistic relationship with ants, which also plays a role to defend the trees. These adaptations provided acacia trees with an initial escape from heavy herbivory, allowing them to thrive and expand their range. But over time, certain herbivores evolved specific adaptations to overcome the defenses. I mean, whether we're talking about giraffes that developed long tongues and lips to get around the thorns, or insects like the bagworm moth that evolved a tolerance to acacia tannins, allowing them to feed on the leaves. As herbivores adapted to these defenses and exerted new types of herbivory pressure on acacia trees in new and different environments, acacia trees diversified, developing variations in thorn size, tannin concentration, and mutualistic ant relationships across the now hundreds of different acacia species. In subsequent videos, we'll take a closer look at the specific defenses that plants use to deter herbivores, such as physical barriers, chemical defensive strategies, and we'll examine the impressive adaptations that insects have developed to overcome them. We'll explore the ecological and evolutionary implications of these interactions, trying to understand not only how they shape individual species, but also impact entire ecosystems. The story of plant-insect interactions is one of constant adaptation, resilience, complexity, and ultimately demonstrates the incredible role that evolution has played in shaping the natural world. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next time.